Hello and welcome to another edition of How You Livin', a show about life with the Funderburks. I am Dr. Nanette Funderburk, your resident psychotherapist, and as always, I have with me today...
You got your main man, the boogity of boogities.
The boogity of boogities? What in the world is that?
That's me, Chief Funderburk. I'm your husband. So I am your boogity of boogity man.
Okay, I'm not even going to ask any more questions on that. So, but you know what? I'm also excited today because we have with us on the microphone the Honorable Congressman Mark Walker of the 6th Congressional District. So, Congressman Walker, how you living?
Well, I think we're doing pretty good, thankfully for the grace of God, each and every day. But it's a privilege to be with you, Nanette and Keith, as well. The boogity of all boogities. I don't know if that's trending on Twitter at this point, but maybe we could start something. But we feel blessed to be able to have the opportunity to get out and serve the people. About 800,000 folks from here to Cary down into Lee and Chatham counties as well, and wonderful privilege now for 4.5 years to be able to serve in this capacity.
Wow.
Wow, that is just great. I tell you, for those that don't know Congressman Mark Walker, he is a former pastor for over 16 years. I tell you, sometimes we think of folks in Washington, they don't know, but they know. So he's been a former pastor for over 16 years, and we just found out just a few minutes ago that some of that was in music ministry, which is cool.
Yeah, spent a little time as a music and worship pastor, and enjoyed keeping 10% of the audience every Sunday morning a little frustrated with either the guitar was too loud or whatever it might be, or that song was too contemporary. But I'll tell you this, and you guys would probably understand this to a large degree. Some of the best training in the world for serving in a capacity like Congress is serving in ministry.
Yeah,
because you're dealing with people from all walks of life, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different opinions on how things should be operated. So it was incredible education for 16 years serving in that capacity.
Wow, that is so great. Yeah. So, of course, Congressman, he was sworn into office in 2015. He serves as the Vice Chairman of the House Republican Conference, which is the top Republican he's the top Republican of the subcommittee on intelligence and counterterrorism. Whoa, now that's a big committee these days. And he's of course the chairman of the Prayer Caucus and formerly the chairman of the Republican Study Committee. So what we have the 6th Congressional District. You took over right after the death of Harold Coble, is that right?
Well, right before he passed, he decided that he was not going to run again. And about 8 or 9 of us decided to put our hat in the ring, and we were privileged to come out on top. But Howard Coble, very well respected throughout the 6th District, very genteel man. But I remember picking him up one Saturday morning after I'd been elected, thinking that he may want to go to Biscuitville or get some country ham or something. He wanted a hot dog all the way at 8 o'clock in the morning. So it took us a while, but we found him one. But wonderful man, and we're honored to follow behind him.
I'm telling you, I've really some big shoes to fill. But of course, you're really doing a really good job up there in Washington representing this area. You've been here at A&T. We've done some things for the historical black colleges and universities.
Oh, well, it's really personal for us. My wife is a 2-time graduate at Winston-Salem State University. Okay. So our journey of understanding and really learning a lot about the HBCU family was about 10 or 12 years ago when she started her undergraduate work. She is a level 1 trauma family nurse practitioner. In fact, tonight she'll be flying on the helicopter, Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center, Air Care there. And so she's the real hero in the family as it is anyway, having raised 3 knuckleheads on top of working full time and going to school. But that's where we learned about HBCUs, yes.
Wow, that's cool. What'd you say, Dr. Funderburk?
I see you know how to answer when talking about your wife. Good job.
Well, if you can't speak from the heart, at 27 years this in December, it doesn't take people long to notice who the special one is, but when we're together, so you might as well just acknowledge it up front. You may have that same issue.
Happy wife, happy life.
Exactly.
So
necessarily.
So we go ahead and dig into some of this other material. We don't have that long, but locally here, the United Way of Greater Greensboro has a single focus about ending poverty. Poverty and mental health significantly impact communities all across the listening audience. And so what we wanted to talk about deals with, this economic stress and mental stress are real, and it's affecting people all throughout the 6th congressional district, and really, more importantly, all across the nation, really.
Yes.
How are you looking at addressing poverty from your perspective?
Well, it's interesting, the last part of your question. You talk about mental health, but then you said, how are you addressing poverty? Which we know is correlated in a direct relation with people who are feeling the stress with mental health. I think in this year's budget, I was looking at last year's, I wanted to see what was proposed. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administrations within the HHS, I believe, have increased the funding to these areas by $2 billion. I think, and it may be off $100 million or so, but I think it's $5.6 billion this year. So funding certainly is always an important part of this. But there's also another aspect as far as from an educational standpoint. How do we help people pull themselves out of poverty? And a lot of times that it is certainly getting out there and doing our best to provide the resources, the tools, the education that's needed. Sometimes people talk about minimum wage, for example. Is that a factor in some of this as far as increasing minimum wage? And sometimes those are difficult choices, and let me explain why that is and then why it's connected. If you're a young entrepreneur and you're coming out and you're starting with an idea, to be able to maybe grab a couple people that can help you further your ideas for $8, $9, $10 an hour is all you can afford. And maybe 4 to 6 employees is all you can withstand. So to be able to say, the federal government's going to come in and tell you that you have to pay a minimum of $15, a lot of times these young entrepreneurs have a tough time getting out of the gates. So in talking to that, maybe give a 2 to 3 year window, because 67% of all jobs in this country are small businesses. Mm-hmm. So you want to have a little bit of love there and not to get too much in the weeds, but I think the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, said if you did force a minimum of $15 an hour, it would cost about 1.3 million jobs in the country. It would also increase some of the people as well. So there are pros and cons to each of this. But when it comes down to that mental health capacity, and I can, as we talked about being from a former minister, this is something that's impacting all our communities, above poverty, low poverty. But in looking at the numbers, you are correct, Keith. There does seem to see a little bit of, for those who are below the poverty line, specifically in the black and brown communities, we are seeing some increased levels in there. And I think upon government agencies or whoever it might be, that should create a little bit more attention as far as what we need to resolve this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tell you, it's just so important that we, end poverty. So, do you support an increase on the minimum wage?
I did not vote for the increase in the minimum wage, and along with dozens of my fellow Democrats there in Congress, who just felt like that this would be too big of a burden for small businesses to undertake. Okay. It doesn't mean that large corporations and companies, but I'll tell you this. As I travel throughout the 6th District, I have visited and toured hundreds and hundreds of businesses. The number one thing that I hear is they simply cannot find the people to come in and fill the positions. And these jobs are $13, $14, $15, some $16 and $17 an hour starter wages. So it makes me wonder, is in bridging the gap, is it something that we're not doing well with from a school standpoint or a community college, that we're teaching these trade or semi-skilled positions, that by the time that you're 18 or 19 years old, that you already have a job waiting for you, you've already got some college credits waiting for you. So I think that's a better approach than coming in and telling my friend who runs the yogurt stand that instead of having 6 employees paying $9 or $10 an hour, he's going to have to go to 3 because he's going to be forced now to pay $15 an hour. Sometimes the things that sound best on paper, does it do well when it comes to the practical side of forcing some of these small businesses to be able to pay up that wage and maybe can't offer the services they did at one time?
Wow, interesting stuff. Let me ask this question. So let's dig a little bit deeper in
Sure.
mental health. What do you think about what's happening in Washington from a mental health perspective?
Well, I think over the last 10 years, a few years before I got there, I think people started realizing that we had been focusing more on the symptoms than actually the core of the issue. Why do people act out? Why is there a process of some of the spikes that we've seen in some of the institutionalizing of our citizens? And we want to sometimes go after the symptoms of it as opposed to looking at what the base level is. So I think the first thing that we do, and I think the church is still learning to do this, is remove the stigma for mental health. A lot of times, I know growing up in the church, if there was a physical health need, if there was anything else, financial, whatever it might be, everybody was good with that. But if you brought mental health into it, everybody would start talking about, okay, what's the situation, what you doing, and I think the church has had to grow in that area. It hasn't arrived, but not only the church, but also in the area that I work in now, the federal government, I still think that there's still a stigma, whether it's the federal government or it's the education arena, and sometimes people are just wired different. I won't get into the specifics of it, but we have a close family member that has had to deal with anxiety issues, that just some things just overwhelm them more often. And rather than looking at that person as less or not being able to achieve all their God-given talent, I think it's had to go back and change that. And that's why I think you've seen the increased funding over the last 5 or 6 years in dealing with some of these issues, or directing that money to go to organizations who are doing a good job with it.
That's really good.
So, then, like we've already said, you were a former pastor. Now you're working in Washington as an elected official, a congressman. So how can you encourage individuals who are facing these struggles, whether it's socially, mentally, economically? How do you encourage?
Yeah, a wonderful question, because that's got to be something, and I'm sure that comes in all the way to the local family level, the state level, all the way to the federal level. I think I was listening, my wife and I were watching, I think it's Tyler Perry, one of the Medea's things, where it's kind of, he's doing this, taking questions, but one of the things he talks about is getting people in your life that are positive. In other words, knowing how to shed people sometimes, and I know this is more on the social side, I'll cover all the different, but socially, I think you have to watch out that you don't put people in your life that are negative and always dragging you down, and never talking about the hope side of things. One of the things that we were able to do over the last 10 years is do some inter-ministry work in places like New York and Baltimore and Cleveland. And I remember working with a group in Cleveland, and we were asking, okay, what did you bring? We were doing all of our checklist items, and I said, was there anything else? He said, yes, bring hope. And I think putting people around you that understand that we have a higher calling on our lives, that aren't people that's going to be just a negative influence. And I'm not just talking about drugs, and I'm just talking about people who are always looking at the glass half empty, the people that are always saying, well, you can't do that, you don't come from the right background, you don't have the right wealth, whatever it might be. I think that's one thing that we can get surrounded by, and that keeps us in a low perspective. That's the social side. Economically and politically, I think that we need to continue to make sure that we are able to identify that whether they're nonprofits, whether they're state-run, whatever it might be, organizations that are offering the resources needed for the mental health. But the final piece of this, Nanette, and this is something that I realize, is to be able to educate the community to know where these resources are and are available. It's amazing how many federal resources and state funding resources are never even tapped into, because there's something that breaks down between communicating what is available and what's not available in our society.
I do agree with that, because I've seen people in in mental health crisis sometimes not really knowing that that, like you said, there's help. There's help out there, whether it's through state funds, whether it's through something with their job, there's help. So yes, I can see what you're saying there.
Well, I wanted to make sure everybody look. The show is called How You Living, a show about life with the Funderburks. I tell you, we've got a really neat gentleman. His name is Congressman Mark Walker. He represents the 6th Congressional District. So he's a familiar face here on campus, and so we do want to recognize that. Let's continue. So this discussion.
I'll jump in.
Okay, good. What you got?
So let's just jump right there. Back in, I can't remember what month it was, not very long ago, Congressman Walker, you attended the president's rally in Greenville, North Carolina,
yes,
where they chanted, "Send her back." And you then tweeted that you struggled with the racist chant. So can you explain your use of the word struggle, and what would you say to people who are negatively targeted when they hear this type of language?
Oh, Nanette, thank you for even offering me the chance to talk and discuss something that's really really a depth and a heart of our political language and discourse these days. I did attend the rally and was really taken back by that probably 35 or 40% of a group of 8,000 to 10,000 people that had begun to chant that. I wished the president had stepped in immediately and said, no, that's uncalled for. But as I drove back, one of the things that I do, I've got different coaches or people that I respect a lot. One of them's Odell Cleveland here in the area. And I called him. I said, Odell, I'm really struggling with what I heard and what I saw this evening, and how do you address this thing? And he says, well, sometimes it's good to speak publicly, and we talked a few things. Well, I'm literally driving back that night from Greenville, North Carolina, where the rally was, to Washington D.C. And I just, in my mind, just voice texted that what I was dealing with internally, that I was struggling with what I saw and what I heard that evening. In fact, that part was picked up. The other part of my tweet, which was in the original thing that I said, was talking about how damaging that is to our communities and our friends in the minority communities. And I didn't think a whole lot of it as far as just saying, listen, I'm not going to walk away here without saying something. And I think there was a couple actors or something that just took the part that struggled out, and maybe I felt like misinterpreted or miscommunicating what my emotions or feelings were with the situation, just like we would struggle with something that we would see or that we would hear. That was the point I was trying to making. I went on and made a stronger point. In fact, on Morning Joe the next day, Joe Scarborough, we did get some kind of credit because we talked about how offensive that was. That part of it wasn't included in everything that had been said through the media, and that happens sometimes. I'm not making an excuse. It's our job to be very clear on the things that we do and the things that we talk about. But I have no problem calling that out, whether I'm a Republican, Independent, Libertarian, Democrat, you name it. When we hear things or we see things, the politics of it should become secondary to what we're able to do. And what I thought of that night was the many people. We have 30 to 40,000 Democrats that support us each election, and not just from the politics of it, but I thought about how hurtful that was in some of the places, some of the relationships that God's provided in our life. Part of my job is to have the responsibility to call a spade, and that's exactly what I felt like that we were doing. Some would have wanted it stronger there to begin with, and I can understand that, but we made sure that we followed up the next 2 or 3 days, and even places like CNN. I think we did 12 minutes with Wolf Blitzer one afternoon talking about this. There's no doubt on the national level where we stand on this issue, and I hope that I would say that we would never relinquish the courage that it takes to be able to call this out, even when it's, there's some right-wing things, and there's one statewide magazine that went after me for doing this and being too moderate or whatever. But you know what? I do what's in my heart, what I feel like is best, and I'm at peace with that at the end of the day.
Well, let me ask you this question. So some things is going on, I guess, over the last few months about what's going on at the border, the southern border. As a pastor, as a former pastor, how do you deal with that on a personal level?
Well, I think as first and foremost, my faith is what identifies me more than my political party status. And I hope that's always the case. I have been to the border as the ranking member for counterintelligence and terrorism on Homeland Security. That is something that we have to monitor as well. And I struggle with the amount. I think our border agents captured 800,000 pounds of drugs last year, enough fentanyl to kill everybody in North America. And we've also seen a huge growth in the human smuggling. In fact, those that come from Central America pay about $8,000 in U.S. dollars to be able to be smuggled in. So there's a lot of danger. According to Doctors Without Borders, 1 out of every 3 young ladies are sexually assaulted who are migrants who come across the border. So look at it from the position of how do we do something that offers long-term resolve when it comes to that. Specifically, I also think we have a responsibility to make sure that people are treated like human beings. And that is something that we have to monitor. And not to be too partisan, but what I saw there was a lot of young men and young women who are part of the Border Patrol, doing everything from changing diapers to mixing baby formula. But there's been such an overwhelming, just in the Rio Grande Valley alone, there's been people apprehended from 60 different countries in the tune of 450 to 60,000 people. So there is some overwhelming there that the federal government was slow to react to be able to offer the facilities. Now they have 24-hour around-the-clock medical care. I'm not saying that everything is completely where it needs to be, but I think sometimes whether it's on the left or the right, we like to paint a narrative that's a little bit exaggerated. But to your question, as a former minister, I hope that I see people, and I believe that I can say I do, in a way that I hope that Christ tells us to see people, and that is the value and the God-given talent that each and every person that God's created for them to have. So that it's a complicated issue because there is a security component, there's a drug component, there's a human smuggling component, at the same time to balance where we're treating these people like human beings as well.
Wow. Yeah. Again, for those that are just joining us, you're listening to How You Livin, a show about life with the Thunderbergs. We've got a new good friend. I tell you, we've really seen the congressman in action. We've got Congressman Mark Walker, who's been with us serving in the 6th District since 2015. So, Dr. Thunderberg, what you got for us?
So, I'm not sure if we may have just, floated over it. When we were talking about, the tweet, what would you say to the people who were negatively targeted with that language?
Well, I think you got to call out if there's something going on that's racist based, I should say. I believe you got to call it what it is, and that's exactly what it is. That terminology to send them back or send her back. Ever since and I'm 50 years old. Ever since I was a young boy, I'm not ignorant to the fact of knowing how hurtful and what that's designed to do and who that is said to. And choose my words carefully here, but in just being completely transparent, when I was a youngster, that chant mean to send the black people back to Africa. Let me just call it what it is. So when you hear that, there ought to be something that triggers in your heart and in your spirit immediately. And that's why in driving back, I could not go back to Washington, D.C. without saying something. In fact, the next morning I had breakfast with the Vice President, and I looked him in the eye, sitting 4 feet directly in front of me across the table, and I said, Mr. Vice President, I want the President to know that chant cannot be part of our rallies. It just can't be. And I understand that, and we're blessed to get into the political arena, that this president will probably get more votes from the minority community since Richard Nixon did, all the way back in 1972. And I think a lot of that's because there are some policies, criminal justice reform, opportunity zones, the lowest unemployment in the minority community in history since we've been recording it in the early 60s. There are some good things, but it doesn't give you a pass to either condone what you see or what you hear that you know is offensive to people in our minority communities. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, you should put aside the worry about getting trashed by this group or that group, and I know it's about votes and ratings and all that, to be able to call it what it is. And I'm grateful there are shows that came out and acknowledged me, whether it's Morning Joe on MSNBC or Wolf Blitzer on CNN, that said the contrast of having one Republican, I know this sounds self-serving, but to answer your question, to come out and call this what it is, which is offensive. And we're proud to do that. We're going to continue to do that. It's one of the things that we're very proud about in our work in the minority communities, not just from a political standpoint, but because of my own personal history, because of my time as a minister. I believe that is how, when you send somebody to Washington, D.C., is to look at the full scope of things and make sure that you remember that you're representing everybody, not just one particular group.
Yeah. Because Dr. Thunderberg, I think you and I were talking. I mean, we're seeing this in our office.
Yeah, we are seeing this in the office, and people are fearful, people are anxious, people are upset, frustrated, angry, and for some it's exacerbating mental health issues that were already there. For others, it's kind of creating definitely some anxiety.
I'll put it this way. To me, real leaders bring people together. And I've seen it whether it's in ministry, whether it's in business, whether it's in politics. There are some people who are manipulators who bring a loyalty to themselves as opposed to the cause, and then that's maybe another day on the radio to talk about some of that. But I want to be the kind of leader that brings people together. I said this on CNN the other day, and I believe it was to Wolf Blitzer. I said, you know what? I would want my children and my family to emulate the kind of president and the kind of father and husband that President Barack Obama was. There were no chinks in his armor when it comes to being a father and a husband, much more than we would President Trump. I've said that on record. But at the same time, I have to look at the policies. There were 4 million more people driven into poverty during the 8 years of the previous administration. There's been 2.5 million people taken out of poverty. We are sending nonviolent criminals home each and every week due to the Republican criminal justice reform. The opportunity zones is allowing bigger and larger investment into poverty areas than any time in our history. So it's the difference between the policy and the personality. Maybe the president could stay off Twitter a little bit more and just focus on the policies, because I think sometimes the language, the tweets, the inability to call things out where they are when it comes to some of the racist language that we see still in some of our Republican base, the lack of being willing to do that becomes the story, as opposed to the policy that is alleviating, that is making progress, that is tapping into that. And I'm not saying that President Obama didn't get some of this started, but some of the things that are now been signed into law, there's strong evidence that these things are trending in the right direction.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me think about this as we getting ready to close out the show. When we think about, words actually matter. So as we close, well, I'm closing with the thought of hope and encouragement that you could give to all constituents across the 6th district. What would you say from a hope and an encouragement perspective, for those that may be unemployed, for those that may be fighting, working 2-3 jobs to make ends meet, to those that are dealing with a mental illness or a physical illness? What words of encouragement and hope would you leave for those folks?
Great final question, and I hope my answer could be well enough that's as good as the question that you posed there. As I mentioned earlier, it is about hope. And we still have, according to our numbers and statistics, there's still about 5%, maybe just a little bit less, who are working the 2 jobs. And I think it's the balance of this is helping people understand that it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. And I think sometimes the mentality that we pick up sometimes, whether it's the political heaviness of the rhetoric or due to the own situation that we were born into or grew up in, is that we think that we have a ceiling on our capability. And I'm one that believes that God creates every single individual with unique abilities and skills and talents. Now sometimes, because of the extenuating circumstances, we have to build a little bit of a ramp to help people realize that. And I'm for that. I'm going to keep voting to help fund some of those things. But I think a lot of that comes back to, do not look at yourself as a victim. And I know there's some people, as a former pastor, there's some people who have been through some heavy stuff. I get that and I understand that. But do not let those circumstances limit to your capability of what you can accomplish in life. And whether it's working through the state government, the federal government, the local government, that's a part of it, that has a role. But never let anybody who serves in any of those capacities tell you how good you are or how good you can be. Wow, that's a good response.
Something to remember, definitely. I want to thank you for coming because everybody doesn't always come to the invitation. So we appreciate you coming.
My privilege.
So before we close out the show, we'd like to remind you to send in your comments or topic ideas to wnaacommunity@gmail.com. And as always, tune in next week for another edition of How You Livin', a show about life with the Funderburks. Take care, y'all.